Now this rather interesting graphic here was produced around 1912. Now, banks have had a long history of trying to create a central bank in the US. They had a go after the War of Independence, they had another go a few years later. Andrew Jackson, who was elected president in, I think, 1826 or thereabouts, called them engines of corruption. And basically, a lot of the crash or the financial crisis leading up to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was engineered by the banks specifically to achieve this. And this is the state that we're living in, that basically banking controls the world. More accurately, and there's much more information, as Costas said, in America. And there's a book by a lady called Ellen Brown called Web of Debt, which gives you a really, she's a lawyer and she's a financial specialist, so she knows what she's talking about. And she talks about the origins of the Fed and how it operates. But effectively, the Fed is owned by 12 regional federal banks. The Fed is a board, and it's made up of these 12 banks. And they, in turn, are privately owned in the majority by what are known as 8 banking families. And they're effectively a banking cartel. Their link with the city is that this banking cartel runs the city. It's where it originated. It originated in Europe. And they control not just the Fed, but they control the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, which is the central bankers' bank. So if you're in any doubt, the world is run by banks. And that's why this graphic is quite telling, even though it's 100 years old. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Cyril? Thanks. Now, we've talked about transnational corporations. In 2011, there was a study published in the New Scientist which looked at the ownership of 43,060 transnational corporations. This is looking at shareholders' registers and common directorships. And what they discovered is that by looking at these cross-holdings and shared directors, they came down to what they called 147 super entities that effectively controlled 40% of this network of 43,060 transnational corporations and 60% of their revenues. That basically means that this 147 corporation network controls most of what goes on in the world. Within the top 20, there are the usual suspects, the banks, Barclays, JP Morgan, Chase, etc. Goldman Sachs. Of the top 50, 147 super entities, 45 are financial companies, so there'll be insurers, banks, and similar related businesses. So this is the web of power that rules the world. But what sits above that, and this is the work that we've been doing in critical thinking over the last 3 years, and this is not my work. I'm merely communicating what we've discovered. And what we've been looking at is trying to understand how the world works, who holds power. And there is a ruling clique, and it is a fairly small ruling clique that effectively controls everything. They control all the levers of power. They control politics. They control the media. They control the City of London. They control the Fed. In fact, most of the things that influence our lives are under their control, except for those that we resist. Now, these levers of control are obscured by layers of deception. And I think Tom's presentation was brilliant in showing how clever and manipulative they can be in covering their tracks. So you have all these various organizations, and when he talked about the Wealth Management Association catering to the filthy rich, or stinking rich, I think was his term, it's not just the stinking rich, it's also Middle England, anybody who's got investable assets, which is my background. But most of them aren't stinking rich, but there are obviously some that are. So it's through all these different organizations. I also belong to something called the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, and our chairman, Alan Yarrow, has just been appointed Lord Mayor. So all of these people, they're just people, but they are incentivized to do what they do. They're incentivized to protect this web of power. Can we take the next slide? So this, at the top, is the ruling clique. And the levers of power are the money and banking and corporations, media, economics and politics. And they dictate academia. I had a meeting with Steve King, who's a renegade economist from Australia, who's now heading up the University of Kingston's Politics, Economics and History department. And he said that an economics degree is a £27,000 lobotomy, because you only get part of the story. So the reason that you only get part of the story is that education and media are very carefully controlled by the same forces that control the other levers of power. And these levers of power exercise themselves in things like trade agreements, so TTIP, TPP, CETA, and all the others. And the main thrust is to drive deregulation and to effect legislation, as all the speakers have hitherto explained how they do it through the remembrance or various other mechanisms. In the US, I've forgotten the figures, but the number of lobbyists per representative is just mind-boggling. So the people get no representation, but companies get more than their fair share. So there are two primary objectives to this mechanism. One is maximum wealth extraction through debt interest, through profits, through taxes, and through rents, because rents on land should be held communally, but it isn't, it's privatized. So they extract all the wealth, and the other main objective is to achieve effectively a one world corporate government. And if you think back to that web of power diagram where they control all the corporations, recognizing they control all the other things that I've mentioned, we're not far away. So they have, from a philosophical point of view, the European Union and the UN are excellent ideas conceptually, but they too are manipulated by the same forces, as evidenced by trade agreements. Who are these people at the top? Can we take the next slide? Essentially, starting in 1954, and this group has been around for a lot longer, this goes back centuries, but to try and get a handle on who these people are, in 1954, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Rettinger started off something called the Bilderberg meetings, and this involves European royalty, involves banking dynasties, corporate dynasties like the Thyssons, the Agnellis in Italy, all the banking families that you would know as household names, but you don't see their names in the high street because they are sitting behind all the brand names that you see. Above those are the banking dynasties. And then of course it's not a permanent set ruling clique. It changes. So the super rich join it. So people like Soros or Eric Schmidt from Google, they attend these meetings. And of course our politicians attend these meetings to get their orders, as do some of the media. Not to report on what goes on, but to be part of the agenda setting. So the Economist are representative there, the FT, both owned by Pearson and both reputedly controlled by the same forces that I alluded to. And there's plenty of circumstantial evidence to support that. So what we're fighting in fighting TTIP is a war, but it's only one battle in a long war. And until we recognize that we can kill off TTIP, we can stop TTIP, we can stop TITA. Can we have the next slide? Oh no, sorry, I thought I had another slide, don't worry. We can stop TISA. Now TISA we haven't talked about, Trade and Services Agreement. If TTIP and CETA are to satisfy the demands of the banks, Trade and Services Agreement is doing it in spades. It's all about banking deregulation, and that's coming down the track. And if we stop all those agreements, there will be more coming. Excuse me, more coming. And therefore, we need to understand this picture in order to remove the levers of power. And I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole new discussion. But I hope I've given you a flavour of the way finance works. I think I've covered everything I meant to. Thank you.